I think the games industry is light years ahead of almost every other industry in many respects, but this is somewhere where we are stuck 2 decades ago. And I think it goes back right to the beginning of games, right? Where games as an industry and game developers have always been intermediated by platform. First with the consoles, then the mobile game developers, and even on PC, the storefronts. It is very unusual today to have a value chain where the producers have no connection to users in the way that we do.
Can you escape the App Store tax without building your own e-commerce or publishing on a third-party app store? Hello and welcome to Growth Masterminds. My name is Koetsier. It's not a shock. If you're in the industry, third-party app stores are a huge topic right now. Google has always sort of allowed that. Apple's just starting down that path, sort of, in Europe at least. But is there another way? Maybe. Today we're chatting with Stash.Gigi's head of product, Archie Stonehill. He's a former McKinsey analyst. He's been a VC. He's now head of product at Stash.Gigi. It's a platform created by Twitch architect Justin Kan and Zynga alum Robin Chan, as well as a former Googler. Welcome, Archie.
Thank you for having me.
Super pumped to have you. And as we mentioned sort of before starting to record, wow, we couldn't have picked a better time.
Yeah, been nonstop since Google and Epic in December.
Wow. And of course, we all knew that the DMA, Digital Markets Act in Europe, was going to force some significant change. But I think a lot of us, and I'm going to put myself in that bucket, were way too optimistic about what that change would look like and what Apple would have to do in specific, as well as Google at some point perhaps, to kind of align with the regulation. Talk about your sense as you've seen what's gone on in the last week or so.
Yes, I think a lot of the reactions I've seen had expectations that we should have tempered based on Apple's previous responses to similar pushes. I will say, though, even I would say I was as pessimistic as one can be, was surprised by some aspects of the new policies. But I think the way that I think about these pro-competitive pushes is there's three vectors to think about that governments can push on and policies can change on. So one is kind of native in-app payments for apps distributed through the App Store. I think this is the kind of last bastion that will ever fall, and that the platforms will do everything they can to protect them. So you will, I think, take a long time before you see an app you're selling through the App Store be able to incorporate an alternative payments provider at terms that aren't, close to the normal commission. The second one is alternative distribution channels. This was perhaps where I and many were most excited about the Digital Markets Act. I was surprised that Apple included a per install fee in their approach here. But I think it's important to acknowledge that the DMA has done something quite radical in forcing Apple to even open this up, right? It's the first time Apple has allowed siloed apps. The final channel is just outside of app sales. So that is, web shops or even cross-platform. And I think maybe there we've seen, this is the least covered, I would say. It's the least sexy. But I think that is somewhere you've seen perhaps the most movement globally because of America's Supreme Court decision on anti-steering, and where I think a lot of mobile game devs have made a lot of progress in recent years.
Yeah, and that's super interesting, hey, because if we're honest, that's been happening for some time now, right? In fact, for years, where if you're a big game and you've got whales who are spending, let's say, hundreds or thousands of dollars a month in your game, there's been some backdooring of, hey, by the way, you can get that package over there and it's a little bit cheaper. And there you go, right? But I think it's important to mention, and we're going to get into all the stuff, and we're going to get into what Stash is, how it works, and all that stuff. It's important to mention that an aspect here is, hey, when you have a digital business on a mobile platform like iOS or Android, your customers are not actually your customers. They are the platform's customers. and the platform takes the payment. The platform has the payment mechanism. The platform owns the relationship to a large extent. You can try and work with that. You can try and ameliorate that. You can try and create accounts, and you can try and do all sorts of things. But fundamentally, that's one big thing there too, right?
100%. And I think that I think the games industry is light years ahead of almost every other industry in many respects, but this is somewhere where we are stuck 2 decades ago. And I think it goes back right to the beginning of games, right? Where games as an industry and game developers have always been intermediated by platform. First with the consoles, then the mobile game developers, and even on PC, the storefronts. It is very unusual today to have a value chain where the producers have no connection to users in the way that we do. I think that developers kind of woke up to this fact most acutely when IDSA was deprecated, and they realized that they actually knew very little about their customers because they had just been using a box. But it puts developers, I think, in A, a very vulnerable position, and then B, I think has really, negative, somewhat obscure impacts on product design and innovation. And I think it blocks a lot of what could be a very fruitful and productive relationship. So almost every part of what we're seeing now in terms of deplatformization is about developers waking up to the fact that they need to have direct relationships with their players in kind of disintermediated fashions and finding whatever way to do that. I think web is a very easy, frictionless way of doing that, but we've also seen the rise of cross-platform. So it's happening on multiple vectors, and it unlocks tremendous opportunity to not just get a higher share of the revenue that you're making, but also to, as you say, learn more about your players and I think serve them completely new experiences in ways that are unfettered by rules or regulations or policies that kind of impede your ability to innovate. Um, and as you say, it works particularly, I think the main reason it's viable in games is because of free to play monetization. If this was an industry where you had to shift 70% of your users to a specific channel in order to actually do anything positive, it would be very tough. But and for many games, you have to shift 1% of your users and you've got 70% of your spend. And, the value you're capturing by shifting them. And I always like to point this out. A lot of people, like I think Apple and Google have achieved something when they made us think of it as a 30% tax. But the fact of the matter is that actually it's almost always more than you think because it's 30% of gross revenue, not net revenue. So what the developers typically think of as revenue is that 70% amount. So the ratio isn't 10-3, it's 7-4. So in fact, the amount of money that's going to Apple and Google is about 45% of what you're making as a developer. So you have 45% more revenue to split between you and the player in order to get them to use that channel. You can really do some exciting things in terms of sharing that.
Super interesting. And just before we dive into how you're hoping to solve that, planning to solve that, maybe solving it right now, it is interesting to see that in their response to the DMA, Apple said, hey, you know what? Fine, go ahead, use another app store, or fine, stay in our app store and use an external payments provider, but we're still going to charge you a platform fee. And the platform fee is not small. In fact, we're talking 50 cents per user, per install, per year.
Yeah.
That absolutely destroys freemium models and destroys virality. The example I gave when I did a blog post on Singular's blog about this was Flappy Bird. You remember Flappy Bird is like 4 or 5 years ago, maybe 10 years ago. I forget how long ago. Some random developer in Vietnam creates some app. It's the simplest app you could ever imagine. It grows massively, insanely, incredibly. He's making $50,000 a day. He's making so much money. He's freaked out by it. But I calculated if he had to pay this platform fee, he'd be losing millions of dollars a week.
Yeah. I think that that's a very good point. The nice thing about the 30% cut is like you only have to pay it if you do well, if you succeed. And I think that this alternative policy was architected to make it as unattractive as a policy as possible, not even to get the most compensation for Apple. I don't think that was their objective. I think they're just trying to make it a non-viable choice for many developers. And agreed. I mean, I thought per install fees were out of fashion after everything with Unity, but I do think this goes to show what happens in a competitive versus non-competitive market. One has to withdraw the policy because there's an alternative that developers can use. The other one can still conduct the policy, Apple, because they know that there's no alternative. Having said that, you are right. For many, many games, this is a deal killer. However, if your per user spend is greater than $5 a year, you're actually going to start saving money by using the install fee. Perhaps I think the most egregious part of the fee is that it applies even to App Store installs if you adopt into the alternative terms above 1 million installs. So if I'm distributing on 2 app stores, the Apple App Store and a third party, on my millionth and first install on the Apple App Store, I even pay this fee, but I also pay a reduced commission of 20%. So if I make about $5 a year from these from my users, this starts actually making economic sense because of the reduced commission, even if I don't distribute on the alternative app stores, and it's a bit less than that if you do. So that means that I think a lot of mid-core games, and I wonder why Apple didn't pick up on this, because a lot of casino games, a lot of strategy games, they're making a lot more than $5 per user per year. Unfortunately,
Per user or per paying user?
Per user. I mean, if you have a
Wow.
year-long payback and an LTV of $5, it's not atypical. That's actually pretty low. I mean, some of these games will be making $20, $25 a user per year. Some of them will be making more. And the truth is that, you can optimize for this now. I mean, I think it's always fascinating to consider what downstream impacts these changes will have on design decisions and innovation. I mean, what they've done here is they've said, go out and find as predatory a game as possible, arguably, because what they're optimizing for is the highest possible LTV on the fewest possible installs. And it has all sorts of interesting implications for user acquisition. You no longer want to do those creatives that are going to lower your CPI. Maybe you want to have really high CPIs. So it'll be interesting to see how it shakes out. But for a category of games, it's quite exciting because of the reduced commission to 20% versus 30%.
And not just games, actually. If you look at a service like Calm, or you look at other services that are high value subscription services, training services, membership services, that sort of thing, it may actually, like you say, significantly reduce the amount that they pay. That's actually really, really interesting. It doesn't apply, of course, as Spotify has been shouting loudly on their blog and on their LinkedIn to Spotify, because Spotify itself pays 70% of what it makes to artists and keeps 30%. To run the service and pay its people. Anyways, okay, we've delayed long enough. Talk about Stash, what it is, what you built, what it looks like, how it works.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I think games as an industry have always had a kind of intermediated relationship between players and developers. And I think that is the core kind of problem or like fact that motivates Stash. And Stash kind of sees a future in which developers can be their own platforms for the first time. I think that the challenge, though, is that like what are game developers good at? They're good at making games. They're great at serving players. But maybe not direct consumer experiences. I think you've seen a lot of stumbles in direct consumer PC with a lot of the big publishers trying to launch stores and failing for various reasons. So what we want to do is kind of be the anti-platform, be the direct consumer platform for developers, not just providing them the kind of like functional requirements to operate a direct consumer platform. So that's identity stuff, payments, but actually providing a lot of that expertise. So our approach is to say, game developers have never operated direct consumer channels. Very few have successfully. Other industries have. And in fact, other industries have seen this process of disintermediation work really well. So if you look at, fashion, right, with digital e-commerce, initially in the first wave of digital e-commerce, you had continued intermediation of the fashion houses, where you had Net-a-Porter and Farfetch and those guys rise up because they were used to selling through larger companies, larger storefronts. Then the fashion companies realized they were giving away money for nothing, and they all launched direct to consumer, and they've had huge success for it. And then similarly, other industries have kind of fended off a marketplace intermediating them, like hotels and airlines operate very, very successfully directly to consumers. So even though I would probably save money using a marketplace to buy a flight, for example, I may well buy direct because of my status and because of my, British Airways kind of, I wouldn't say loyalty, but like incentives. And then similarly, like somewhat not commodified industries, but industries like real money have hugely succeeded in client service because those product differentiations are really about they're not about the product necessarily, right? Otherwise, that would just be a slot game when it was competing on product would compete on price. So they've done a great job at building all of these support functions to incentivize their customers, to engage with them directly. So our approach is to say, okay, we don't think this expertise really exists within games right now. We want to look elsewhere for the expertise necessary to build a really compelling direct consumer value proposition. So that's the kind of first principle. The second one is that uh, you have to focus on like experience, not convenience. So the reason that is so important is you will never build a more convenient distribution channel than Apple, or a more convenient payment product than Apple. So you won't win on convenience. And that's fine because of the whale monetization stuff we said, the small number of users. What you need to offer is a better experience. So we are trying to provide the functional requirements to sell directly and to have an identity system of your own. But more importantly, the expertise and the guidance and the kind of like best in class, practices for operating a really compelling, enhanced e-commerce experience, and just generally direct consumer experience outside of e-commerce that is going to be a better, premium, way to engage your players and your spenders than you can find on the apps.
So I want to get into how it works. I assume you're not just offering this in the EU, you want to offer it everywhere. I want to talk about how you can make that happen. Is it safe? Will Apple kick somebody off the App Store? Will Google get angry at you if somebody uses this? But first off, great idea. Makes a ton of sense, right? I mean, it's a necessary thing. It's a thing whose time has come. Digital businesses should be on a similar level at this stage, or soon anyways, as physical businesses, right? Why the distinction? So D2C makes sense there. And also building a platform. I mean, who wants to handle refunds? Who wants to handle all the infrastructure that you have to do it right, to do it well? Is this gonna be better for, and I'm just gonna throw some names out there. I have no idea who's your customers or anything like that, and at this point, it might be dangerous for them to say that they are, so don't say that. But is this better for, like, a big publisher with lots of games who's implementing it across all their games or apps and maybe has a brand? So I'm kinda thinking of like a Rovio or something like that. They have a brand, they're known, they have many games, they have hundreds of millions of users. Is it better for somebody like that, or does it also work for like an indie that nobody knows?
That's a very, very good question. I would say that the company's brand very rarely matters, maybe with the exception of Supercell, because I think even for games players love, they probably don't love the game developer. In fact, in many cases, they probably have a somewhat hostile relationship with the developer. But and this is kind of what the thesis behind Stash is that if you play a lot of, I don't know, kind of maybe Rovio is a bit of an exception, but if you play a lot of a kind of mid-core strategy game, do you really have any knowledge of or awareness of the developer? Probably not. And the reason
Or
behind
are
that,
you pissed off because you're playing and you're adding all this stuff and getting better and everything, and then they add a new type of currency or a new weapon or something like that, and all of a sudden you're falling behind, and it's an arms race, and you got to re-up, and you got to play harder, you got to grind more, and you got to pay more in order to keep up with the cohort of players that you joined with. Yeah, I get your point.
by the way, I play a lot of Raid Shadow Legends, and I love Raid, but I have other feelings towards Plarium because of what you describe, right? I think that there's a disconnect a lot of players have where they don't like the developer, they keep playing the game. And that's partly about a lack of expertise in direct consumer, right? Like it's never been important for mobile game developers to have a well-branded website for their actual development company, because you acquire on the game. The game is the thing the players see and interact with, and that's where Stash comes in. It helps you build that for the game elsewhere, and so I would say that very rarely does company brand matter. I do think the type of game matters. So I think you do want a game that is highly engaging to your best users. So I think a game that is reasonably kind of broad, casual, is tougher to do here because you're asking something from the players. So the player needs to have a degree of buy-in. But I think in terms of size of developer, of course, there's resource allocation decisions and all of that. But if you have a game that has the right economic profile, I think that this makes sense for you. And the right economic profile isn't huge. it's essentially just being able to isolate a small group of users that getting an additional 20 to 30% of that revenue of those users spend would be would make a meaningful difference for you. But fortunately, I think because you're only going after your existing players, your broader presence and brand doesn't matter as much as it does in a lot of other initiatives. Now, having said that, the quantity of your spend matters because that's how much you're saving on. If you don't have users, you can't benefit from, better monetizing them. But I think that's what's exciting about it is it's really like an equation that scales.
Let's talk a little bit about the mechanics of it and how it works vis-a-vis um, the landowner with the Apple or the Google, right? So we did get the ruling in the US again, the anti-steering ruling, right? You can't force people to not say, hey, you can get these same products elsewhere. But there's still challenges, there's legalities. That's just one country. The EU has some other rules, and every other country around the world may have some different rules as well.
Yeah.
How do you, as a developer, move into this, do this, and do so feeling comfortable and safe that you're not going to, well, I guess Apple and Google aren't being happy with you, but they can't do anything to you or they don't have grounds to kick you out?
This is a difficult and important issue. So just on the kind of country level, 'cause I do think it's important to note that the number of regions that have implemented some version of this, and America's gone by far the least, is extraordinary. So it includes Japan, South Korea, the UK's got a new bill which actually goes the furthest, arguably. Australia's done a version of this, and it keeps growing. So I think that at some point it will become too complex for the platforms to have wildly different policies in different jurisdictions. But you are right; there are important differences, and uh, and those often stem from the kind of motivation behind the policymakers' movement. So the DMA in Europe is so unique because its objective is not really consumer oriented; it's pro-competitive. So it's really assessing, is this harming other competitors, other businesses? Whereas America's framework almost always goes back to consumer harm. And so, as you say, what America's done is eliminate anti-steering policies. These are policies that prohibit developers from steering users to another way to pay or another way to buy that's outside of the app and the IAP system. Whereas the EU obviously goes a lot further than that, but includes that. So, what's complicated, however, is these platforms they're not governments. So, they don't have to obey the rules of justice that governments might. And so the degree to which they can act arbitrarily is somewhat kind of high. Now they can't push that too far, or they will be accused of, illegal monopolistic behavior. But truth is, there isn't kind of some, amazing idealized justice system to appeal your removal. So it's a complex issue, and a lot of these regulations and policies that these platforms put out are written deliberately ambiguously to disincentivize experimentation. Now, having said that, even since I started building this product, I've been amazed by how large many big developers already have as a presence in direct to consumer channels, and they keep it somewhat quiet. I think that they don't want to draw too much attention to it, but we're writing an article about this. I actually know a journalist who told me that they wrote an article about various mobile developers' web shops and then got reached out to by two of the developers asking them to take it down. So there's kind of like a don't talk about it thing. But what I think's changed is if you look at what Steam does, and if you look at what mobile app stores did 5-10 years ago, they used to play a really important role in game discovery. And they used to be very important to developers because being featured could be a make or break situation, and they could actually do things that really helped you. If you look at what the mobile guys do now, I don't know anyone who's had like a meaningfully impact from being featured recently. The kind of featuring space has been monetized and turned into ad space. But B, it's always the same games and it leads to a negligible bump. So outside of kind of just basic distribution, these stores don't do much. I think that's a result of a lack of competition because if you look at Steam, it's still hugely important for discovery for players. But if you're a developer, ask yourself, what do I need from these guys short of being on the store? It's probably not much. Now, being on the store, I think, is essential. But that's actually, something where you can do a lot if you want to be on the store and you're not looking for discretion. We can talk about the specific policies that will get you kicked off and who's doing what, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, I do wanna talk about, like, can somebody come to Stash and say, "Hey, I wanna use you, I wanna build with you, but I wanna do it safely. How do I do that?"
Yeah. So there's degrees of risk here, clearly. And there are some strategies that would be higher risk and less certain. And there's some stuff which we know is pretty kosher. So what do we know is fine is you are allowed to sell things outside of your store through other channels, right? And I think particularly if you're what's called a multi-platform service, 3D cross-platform game, you have a lot more discretion, which is why a lot of the successes here, like Rage, like some of the Scopely games, have been cross-platform. But you don't have to be. And indeed, even Plarium's, even Playtika's kind of casino games distribute on browser. And as far as I can tell, that can be fairly nominal. So long as you have a presence elsewhere, you can be a cross-platform service. That gives you a lot of discretion. And what you're allowed to do is sell on other channels. And as of the Supreme Court ruling, you're also allowed to do some things using your in-app presence to communicate these channels to others. So before, you were completely banned from communicating to any of your players acquired in the game about alternative channels. That's what the court in America ruled was illegal. And the response to that from Apple, at least, was to come in with a link out kind of entitlement which you can apply, and they get 27% of the revenue you link out to. Now, I don't think the link out stuff sounds viable until that policy changes, but the court also ruled that guideline 3.3, which was the one that talked about communicating out of store channels to your players, was also not okay. So that's opened up a lot. But the truth is, with some kind of savvy techniques, you're able to scale out of channel presences without this link out functionality. And I think Playtika is doing 25% of their revenue through their direct to consumer channels. I think Huge is doing 10%. I think Plarium's doing 30% through Plarium Play. Rovio scaling their channel. Supercell has theirs. Fun Plus. A lot of these developers operate pretty viable web stores, and you can get creative with how you drive traffic. So that's something we help on. Whether it's having other reasons to visit your web environment that aren't stores that you can communicate, if you have a loyalty program, a membership program, other benefits, and then driving the repeat purchases. So that's an exchange of value. That's making it a compelling experience. Having a certain sales strategy that optimizes for return. So maybe you have a weekly offer that's available every Monday that players come back and visit. It's really high value and it just drives traffic. So a lot of this is about strategizing correctly. And a lot of our value add is we will give you a higher share of spend going through your direct consumer channel than you would be able to do on your own. And so, I won't go too much into the detail to there because I think a lot of it tailors to specific games as well. And you have to optimize towards your game category. So for example, if you were a competitive multiplayer game coming to us, a real-time competitive multiplayer game, we would probably help you do a, really kind of rich competitive ecosystem within your web environment that would bring users into it. And then you could use that to drive traffic to your web store. If you're a casino game, you're going to be far more optimizing towards like VIP customer service, loyalty tiers, exclusive content. And what's exciting about this is it really ties in well with your game economy. And, you need to be tailoring this to do it well to slightly to your game or at least to your genre and maximizing on what you get your gamers care about. I think all this stuff isn't just a way to drive traffic to your web shop. It's also a way to, massively enrich your game experience, increase, your retention, boost LTV, as well as obviously just, engage your core players in a kind of like recurring way, capture email addresses. So it has tons of benefits outside of just the margin.
Super smart. And I can see that makes total sense. I'm pretty sure I've seen data that says that multi-platform customers who use your services or connect with you on multiple platforms are much more likely to retain, much more likely to stick with you for a much longer period of time. And there's obvious ways. Hey, we have a coupon code on our Facebook page or on our website for a free thing because you're a loyal user. Thank you so much. Here you go. And it'll give you this free, awesome, amazing thing. Go get it. And when they're there, by the way, there you go. But I like that emphasis on being multi-platform. It makes a lot of sense. And then you sort of kind of fit under the reader platform type exceptions and the multi-platform type exceptions where, hey, yeah, of course, if you're on multiple platforms, people can buy wherever they want to buy because they're using it in different places. That makes a ton of sense. That is great. That is interesting. What does it cost to use Stash?
So at this stage, I think we're working very closely with a few design partners and really trying, as I mentioned, I think a lot of this is variable for depending on your game type. So, we fundamentally like are building out a kind of a very holistic view of what this can look like in different archetypes. So as I mentioned, loyalty and rewards is somewhere I'm really interested in. So we are investing very heavily. Fortunately, we're very well capitalized for a startup. And eventually our business model will be, just purely a payments transaction volume based model, price competitive with our peers on the market. But at this stage, we're operating basically at cost and really trying to invest heavily in making sure we can prove out that if you do this in the way that we think you can do it, you can build something that's so much more than I think a fairly transactional exchange between player and developer. And what I mean by that is I think a lot of the even successes in this case have been a pretty, cutthroat, like, okay, you operate a less experienced purchase experience, but we'll give you 10% off. And while that works, I think there's a way of doing that that's far more engaging. So one of the products we're building, for example, is like a but having said that, right, I don't think developers have a great perspective on how to operate a web-based discount or loyalty strategy. And that's again like where we come in. So if you come to us and say, all right, we want to share, 15-15 split the kind of extra 30% with our players, one of our products will kind of like automate the process of distributing that 15% across a bunch of different ways to offer discounts and different tiered loyalty programs. And you get access to free things if you spend X amount and make it really engaging, but in a way that it kind of averages out to a 15% discount. So you don't have to do the work of applying that discount to productize it in the most engaging way. We'll do it, but you still ultimately get control over, what your overall kind of, incentive cost is. And right now we're kind of like investing very heavily in designing those programs to be very custom to games and doing research into how to cannibalize the least amount of spend through certain giveaways. And can you give away cosmetic content, perception of that value? So, I think for our partners now, the ones that we're, working with and we're still, kind of building out that roster, I think it's a very compelling proposition. Long run, I think hopefully we plan to scale that model much further.
Let's maybe end here. Let's crystal ball a little bit. So we saw the DMA, we saw Apple's response to it. We've seen the epic story, which is epic. And that's a big risk that company has taken. The hundreds of millions of dollars that they've probably spent or at risk of having to repay Apple for fees and all this stuff. Apple's trying to get some legal fees from them, and it's not cheap. Look forward a couple years, and what you think will happen with the legislation that's out there, maybe an EU legislative response to how Apple has structured things in response to the DMA, maybe additional challenges to how Apple and Google do business in the States and other countries. What do you envision? A much freer world? Do you envision many app stores with few restrictions on how they operate? What's it look like to you?
It's a very good question. And I think there's some uncertainty. If you went back 4 years ago, you probably wouldn't have ever, and I told you Apple was going to allow side-loaded app distribution, you probably would have been surprised. I think from a regulatory perspective, like we will see what the EU's response even to this is. They don't need additional regulation in order to reject this as non-compliance. And I wouldn't be surprised if you saw a ongoing and the DMA's enforcement is ongoing. So they will make evaluations in coordination with developers they're speaking to. And I would encourage developers, the EU really listens to your voice. It's pretty extraordinary. You can just email them. And I would encourage you to have an input into that. So the EU is clearly taking action that I think is pretty exciting and will continue to evolve. I think that more countries will institute legislation. As I mentioned, the UK is somewhat leading the way here with their DMCC bill. And I think you'll see progress on regulation. America will see. I mean, we have to see what the impact of the Google Epic trial is. I mean, that's a big uncertainty there. Google was ruled to be operating a monopoly. That could get overturned. We'll see. I think it doesn't behoove you to be very optimistic about American regulatory action here. But having said that, I think regulation is just one piece of this. And the other piece is technology, the advent of game streaming, the increasing power of, HTML5 game distribution. These are all other things that are undermining the kind of dominances of the device and operating system providers. And I don't think that's stopping anytime soon. So, we'll see like how much alternative devices like AR pick up, or, what the new game streaming platforms on mobile offer. I think you'll continue to see more of a unified player experience, cross-play across different apps. So all of these things I think are as powerful in their somewhat less visible shift impact. And so I think what you'll find is like you have a more unified individual experience across online environments. And B, we'll see some very meaningful impacts from regulation, from platforms being forced to give up control. And I think you'll see like developer innovation finding ways to productize what is possible in these new markets in ways that you don't expect, right? Whether it's single app experiences that are alternatively distributed, so you cut down on installs, but you have many game types. So I think that the most successful companies will be thinking really creatively about how this new policy landscape unlocks opportunities for product innovation.
That is super interesting. And Apple just released some developer documentation that they now allow mini games inside, or mini apps inside an app. And so, what is a mini game exactly? How do you define that? How many does it have to be? Can I have one Uber app for my massive publisher and all my experiences are played inside there? And then I have a common currency. And so, super interesting. We've got to call it here. This has been great. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for sharing some of what you're seeing here, Archie.
Thanks so much for having me, John. It's been great.